The air didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just hung heavy and scalding, like a sheet of metal being heated by a welder's torch. Elias hadn't moved in 3 minutes. He couldn't afford to. Every tiny twitch, every muscle fiber firing, was burning a drop of the internal reservoir he no longer had. He sat jammed deep within the shadow of a monolithic granite boulder, his back pressed against the rock's cool, dark core. Cool was a relative term out here. It was the temperature of deep shade, not a breeze. He lifted the canteen. It was olive green, dented, and now cruelly useless. He tilted it, waiting for the comforting slosh, the heavy promise of life. Nothing. Just a thin, desperate tinkle of the last few drops rattling the metal. He had been so focused on navigating the canyons of the Mojave, so wrapped up in the beauty of the desolate landscape for his photography assignment, that he hadn't noticed the subtle creep of dehydration. He'd lost his main pack somewhere in the scramble down a steep, loose scree slope, the one with the 2 gallons of water. Now, all he had was the clothes on his back, a small canvas utility pouch, and a sun that was steadily climbing toward its midday execution. Elias was a survivalist. He knew the numbers. An average adult in this heat loses at least a liter of water every hour through sweat. He'd been awake for 4 hours. He probably had maybe 10 hours of coherent function left before the body started shutting down the systems and the hallucinations began. He gripped the empty canteen. This wasn't a slow burn. This was a race against a clock made of sweat and sunstroke. He knew the single greatest rule of desert survival. Don't search for water during the day. Wait for the cool of evening, conserve energy. But that was the rule for someone with a half-full bottle. For Elias, this was already a zero-sum game. If he waited, the sun would win. He slowly pulled himself up, using the rock for support. It was time to search. Not for a miracle, but for knowledge, the hidden signals that the desert uses to keep its own secrets. The sun was a searing orange disk, making the sand look like shattered glass. Elias knew the first technique wasn't about digging or building. It was about observation. When everything looks dead, look for what isn't dead. The desert always tells a story, and the most compelling chapters are written in motion. He squinted, scanning the horizon. The ground was littered with small, sharp stones and sun-baked clay. No deep sand dunes here, just hard, fractured earth. What he needed was a sign. An animal that knew something he didn't. He ignored the lizards and the scorpions. They could go weeks without a visible water source. He needed birds. Grain-eating birds. They need to drink at least twice a day. He walked slowly, deliberately, keeping his heart rate as low as possible. He wore his utility shirt loosely, avoiding the urge to bunch it up. Evaporation was his enemy. He paused and shielded his eyes. Nothing. Just the shimmer of the heat haze playing tricks on the rock formations. Wait. Just above the ridgeline, a few hundred yards out, he saw it. Not a flock, but a scattered group of small, dark birds. They were diving and wheeling in a way that wasn't random. They weren't migrating, they were focusing. Elias changed direction immediately. This was the first test. Could he ignore the lure of shade and follow the animal indicator? He followed their general line of descent until he reached the edge of a low, rocky canyon wall. The birds were disappearing into a shadowy cleft in the sandstone. He moved into the canyon, the temperature dropping a few precious degrees as the walls blocked the direct sun. The floor here was composed of smooth, wind-carved rock, the sign of fast-moving water in the flash flood season. He scanned the wall where the birds vanished. There, nestled between 2 towering layers of rock, was a series of natural basins, worn smooth over millennia. These were Tanajas, natural rock pools. One of the pools, shielded by an overhang, held a dark, stagnant, but visible puddle of water. It was small. Maybe a pint, dark green with algae and flecked with sand. His heart hammered. It was a visceral, desperate relief. He fell to his knees, resisting the urge to plunge his face into it. Stagnant water is death by 1,000 microscopic cuts. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the only semi-useful item he had, a bandana, his improvised filter. He dipped the bandana into the pool, letting the cloth absorb the liquid. He wrung it carefully into the empty canteen, performing the same action 3, 4, 5 times until the canteen held a couple of ounces of filtered, albeit warm, life. It was a teaspoon compared to the ocean he needed, but it was enough to stave off the immediate madness. He took one sip. Just one. He pressed the cold metal of the canteen against his cheek, savoring the cool surface. The lesson of Acti was learned. The desert doesn't hide everything. It simply requires a specific language to read the signs. But the canteen was still overwhelmingly empty. He needed more. A sustainable source. The sun was now fully overhead. The heat was immense. Elias had to find shade again, but this time he needed a shade where he could work. He found a cluster of low-lying brush and tough desert shrubs in a slight depression nearby. The ground here was less rocky, more clay-like. Clay soil often holds moisture better than sand. He checked his pouch. He had his bandana, a small coil of thin cord for his camera tripod ironically, and a large clear plastic camera bag for protection against dust. This was enough for the solar still, the ultimate test of patience and ingenuity. He found a sunny, open spot and began to dig. This was the greatest risk, the energy expenditure. Digging in this heat was the fastest way to empty his body's tank. He used his hands, then a sharp-edged rock as a primitive shovel. He didn't dig wide, he dug deep. The clay dust was fine and suffocating, coating his throat and eyes. He forced himself to move slowly, keeping his elbows tight to his body, maximizing the force of each scrape and toss of dirt. Dig until you hit moist subsoil, he repeated the mantra. He dug 1 foot. Dry, brittle dust. He dug 18 inches. Still nothing. His palms were rubbed raw, his breathing was shallow and fast. At 2 feet, the color of the earth changed. A darker, richer tone. He scraped it with his thumbnail. It was cool. It was damp. Success. He widened the hole to about 2 feet in diameter. He placed the empty canteen, the collection vessel, in the center of the pit. Next he needed fuel. He tossed handfuls of the surrounding non-poisonous shrubs and tough grasses into the bottom of the pit, surrounding the canteen. He knew these plants would release their internal moisture when heated. Then came the centerpiece, the clear plastic bag. He stretched the bag tautly over the hole, creating a seal against the surface air. He used the displaced dirt and rocks to build a heavy rim around the entire edge of the plastic, locking the still's internal ecosystem into place. Finally, the rock. He placed a single small stone directly in the center of the plastic sheet, positioned precisely above the canteen's opening. This created the necessary depression, a low point, that condensation would follow. He was done. The solar still was a miniature, trapped greenhouse. The sun's rays would penetrate the plastic, heat the moist soil and plants, and cause the water to evaporate. That vapor would rise, hit the cooler plastic, condense into liquid drops, and slide down to the low point, dripping into the canteen. Now came the impossible part, the weight. He crawled back to the meager shade of the brush. He looked at the still, a shimmering, mocking promise on the ground. The rate of production would be excruciatingly slow. Maybe a few ounces over several hours. Elias had exchanged massive, life-threatening energy for a slow, agonizing trickle. He closed his eyes and tried to still the trembling in his limbs. He thought of the true crime stories he'd heard, the slow, psychological torture of a courtroom wait, the tension before a verdict. This was worse. The verdict here was death by dehydration. He forced his mind to focus on the science. If the sun was strong enough, if the seal held, if the moisture was deep enough, he might survive. He spent the next 2 hours in a semi-conscious state of conservation, counting the seconds, fighting the urge to look at the canteen. When he finally crawled over to check, the sun was already starting its slow descent. He peered under the plastic seal. The canteen was barely covered at the bottom. A few tablespoons. Not enough. The desperate gamble hadn't paid off the volume he needed. He had to move to a plan C. The still had bought him a couple of hours and a sip of water, but he was still short. His eyes were dry and a dull, hammering pain had begun behind his temples. Mild dehydration was turning into moderate. He looked at the same cluster of small, tough shrubs he'd used for fuel in the still. These were the true survivors. He remembered a technique taught to him by a survivalist in Arizona, a quiet man who called himself the gardener. Don't try to get the water from the ground, the gardener had said. Let the plant do the work for you. They've already spent the energy on the roots. This was the transpiration bag technique. He still had his large clear plastic camera bag and his remaining thin cord. He chose the densest, greenest branch he could find on one of the shrubs, a section of the plant that was getting the last of the direct afternoon sun. He carefully eased the plastic bag over the leafy branch all the way to the stem. The air immediately felt thicker inside the bag. He used the thin cord to tie the mouth of the bag securely around the base of the branch, creating another perfect, sealed ecosystem. Within minutes, condensation began to form on the inside of the plastic. The leaves were transpiring, releasing moisture vapor, and that vapor, trapped by the cooler plastic, was turning back into liquid. He wedged a small stone under the bottom corner of the bag to create a low point, similar to the still, allowing the drops to gather there. This process was slow, but it was passive. It required zero energy from him. The plant was his silent, invisible ally, working for him against the brutal elements. He leaned against the rock, watching the sun dip lower. The western sky was turning violent shades of red and gold. He felt the energy returning slowly from the tiny sips of still water. The psychological boost alone was immense. The desert was beatable, but only through a patient, intellectual fight. But the night was coming, and with it, the rapid drop in temperature. He still needed a large, sustaining drink before the cold sapped his will. Elias needed one more source. Well, he walked to the lowest point in the canyon floor, where a dry wash snaked between the rocks. This was the path that water took when it rained. Even in the driest conditions, water often collects a few feet beneath the surface of these old riverbeds. It was dark now, the stars beginning to blaze with a brutal, clear intensity. The air temperature was dropping fast. He shivered, a sign that his body was still trying to regulate temperature with too little fluid. He chose a spot in the outer bend of the dry wash, where the force of water tends to dig deeper pockets. He began the final all-or-nothing dig. This time he used the largest, flattest rock he could find as a shovel, scraping and throwing the fine sediment behind him. His movements were slow, rhythmic, powered by pure adrenaline and the knowledge that if this failed, he would not be strong enough to see the dawn. 1 foot. The sand was loose and dusty. 2 feet. The dirt was packing slightly but still dry. 2.5 feet. His entire arm was buried in the hole. He stopped, utterly exhausted, leaning on the edge of the pit, his breath ragged. He wanted to give up. The desert whispered that it was time to rest. He fought the paralysis, scraping just a few more inches. Then his fingers hit something heavy, almost slimy. He scraped again gently. The soil was so saturated it looked like mud. He had found the water table. He didn't dig deeper, remembering the warning, dig too deep and you might hit the mineralized, non-potable water layer beneath the surface. He simply let the hole settle. He waited, listening to the silence of the night. He heard the faint, slow drip 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 from the transpiration bag he had brought with him. He had 2 ounces from the plant. Then he looked into the hole. Slowly, agonizingly, a tiny pool of liquid was seeping from the sides and beginning to collect at the bottom. It was muddy, brackish, and the color of weak tea, but it was water. It was life. He used his bandana one last time, soaking it completely and wringing the cold liquid into the canteen until it was finally, gloriously full. He had just enough water to see the sunrise, hike out the remaining 10 miles to the distant road, and get rescued. He drank slowly, his body accepting the muddy water with a grateful shudder. The sun rose hours later, painting the eastern sky in the same colors it had used to torment him the day before. But this time the light felt different. It was warm, not hostile. Elias walked out of the canyon, leaving behind the small monument to his survival, the solar still glistening with its pitiful output, the plastic bag still condensing moisture for the next thirsty traveler. He reached the highway just after noon, his body bruised, dehydrated, but his mind sharp. The rescue team found him within minutes. Later, wrapped in a blanket, sipping clean, chilled water that tasted like a king's ransom, he realized the story wasn't about the tools he used. It was about the knowledge he carried. The desert is a courtroom and Mother Nature is the judge. She doesn't care about your pleas, she only cares about evidence and law. Elias didn't win by luck, by waiting for a helicopter, or by shouting at the sky. He won by knowing the laws of the land. He knew that the birds were his witness, leading him to the rock pool. He knew that the sun could be trapped and harnessed to distill water from the earth. He knew that the plants were quiet allies, working against the elements on his behalf. He knew where the water flowed even when the riverbed was dry. He didn't find water where everything looked dead. He found it where life was simply reorganized, hidden in the roots, trapped under the plastic, and flowing deep beneath the sand. And that is the desert survival secret. The key to unlocking life is not finding a spring. It's understanding that nothing in nature is ever truly lost. It is simply waiting to be found. If this story reminded you that the greatest tool you have for survival is your mind, then share it with someone who thinks they can't survive anything. Subscribe for more stories that turn knowledge into life, because when everything else looks dead, a prepared mind is the only weapon you'll ever need.